Las Vegas, September 1967. 5 minutes before Dean Martin was scheduled to walk on stage at the Sands, a man named Vincent Torino sent word that Dean would be singing a different song tonight. Not a request, an instruction. The song was a Torna a Surriento, a Neapolitan ballad Dean's mother used to sing in the kitchen of their Steubenville home before she died. Before Dean became the man 2,000 people were waiting to see. Torino knew this because Torino made it his business to know things. And what Dean did in the next 90 minutes would either end the control attempt or end his career in Las Vegas. Vincent Torino didn't own the Sands. His name appeared on no paperwork. He held no official title, but he controlled percentages. He maintained connections that ran through Chicago, Miami, and back to Vegas in ways everyone understood but no one documented. He was 54. Silver hair combed back. Expensive suits that fit perfectly. Soft-spoken. The kind of man tourists walked past without noticing, but staff watched carefully. Torino had been in Las Vegas since the beginning. Since the desert was nothing but highway and hope. He'd watched the city grow, watched the casinos rise, watched performers come and go. And he'd learned that control wasn't maintained through threats. Threats were crude. Threats created resentment, witnesses, problems. Control was maintained through smaller gestures, through favors that became expectations, through requests that seemed reasonable until you realized they never stopped. He'd shaped other performers this way. A singer who started thanking specific people from the stage. Small dedications that seemed spontaneous but weren't. The singer never questioned it. He'd been grateful for the work, grateful for the room, grateful to be playing Vegas at all. A comedian who began avoiding certain material. Jokes that might offend, might reference the wrong people, might create complications. The adjustments happened gradually. Nothing dramatic. Just a slow reshaping of the act until it fit what was expected. A bandleader who adjusted his arrangements to accommodate guests who wanted to sit in. High rollers who couldn't play but wanted the experience. The bandleader made it work, made them sound better than they were, made everyone feel good. None of it dramatic, all of it effective. Dean Martin had been careful so far. Professional, cooperative when it mattered. He took photos with the right people, made introductions, adjusted setlists when the requests made sense. But Torino believed in testing loyalty periodically, in reminding even the most successful performers that cooperation was expected, that there were no untouchable territories, that private grief could become public performance if necessary. Tonight was one of those tests. The information about Dean's mother had come 3 years earlier. A bass player who'd worked with Dean at the Copa Room had mentioned it backstage during a break. Just a passing comment to another musician. Something about Den's family, about the old Neapolitan songs his mother used to sing, about how Dean never performed them even though his voice would be perfect for that material. Too personal, I guess. The bass player had said, "Some things you keep separate." A floor supervisor had been nearby, checking a sound system issue. He'd heard it, filed it away. Information in Vegas moved like water, passed from hand to hand, traded when useful. The floor supervisor mentioned it to a casino host months later, just in conversation, small talk between shifts. The casino host mentioned it to someone in operations. Operations mentioned it to a contact who worked directly with Torino. The information moved quietly, passed like a card in a game where everyone understood the rules without them being spoken. And then it was verified, not dramatically, not through investigation, just through casual research. Dean's background was well documented. His mother's death, the Italian neighborhood he'd grown up in, the songs that had been popular there. Torna a Surriento fit perfectly. Old enough to be authentic, emotional enough to matter, specific enough to prove the request wasn't random. Torino stored it, waited for the right moment. Tonight, that moment had come. Not because Dean had done anything wrong, not because there was a grievance to settle, but because Torino wanted to see if Dean Martin could be moved. The messenger arrived at Dean's dressing room at 8:55 p.m. Curtain was at 9 trelloted. Dean was already dressed, tuxedo perfect, hair combed, face showing nothing. The messenger knocked softly, entered when invited, closed the door with care. He was young, mid-20s, well-dressed but not expensive. The kind of person who delivered messages but didn't make decisions. "Mr. Torino asked me to mention something," he said politely. "There are some important guests in the room tonight. They'd appreciate hearing something traditional, Italian." He suggested torna a sorrento. He thinks the audience would love it. Thinks it would be meaningful. The messenger smiled, delivered it perfectly, like he was doing Dean a favor. "Just wanted to pass that along," he added. "Mr. Torino thought you'd appreciate knowing." Then he left, quickly, professionally. Dean sat motionless. The timing wasn't accidental. 5 minutes before curtain meant no time to negotiate, no time to make calls, no time to think strategically, only time to react. And reactions revealed things that calculated responses could hide. Dean understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't about the audience. This wasn't about Italian guests or meaningful moments. This was about proving that even Dan Martin could be moved, that private pain could be leveraged, that there were buttons that could be pushed. A torna a sorrento belonged to his mother. Angeline Crosetti had died 7 years ago. Heart failure. Quick. She'd been in the kitchen one moment, gone the next. Dean had flown home immediately, left a show half finished, got on a plane while still wearing his stage clothes. Arrived too late. She was already at the funeral home when he got there. He remembered her standing at the stove in their small Steubenville house, stirring sauce, humming torna a sorrento under her breath. The melody would drift through the rooms, mixing with the smell of garlic and bread. She'd had no patience for complaints. When he'd come home from school bloodied from a fight, she hadn't coddled him. She'd cleaned the cuts, asked if he'd started it or finished it, told him to be smarter next time. When he'd told her he wanted to sing, wanted to try something bigger than Steubenville, she'd looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she'd said, simply, "Don't let them make you small." He hadn't understood it then, but he understood it now. Standing in his dressing room 5 minutes before curtain, a request sitting in the air like smoke. She'd meant, don't let them reduce you. Don't let them take the parts of yourself that matter and turn them into tools. Dean had never sung torna a sorrento publicly, never recorded it, never let it become part of the act. It was his, private, protected, and now Vincent Torino was asking him to bring it into the light, not to honor her, but to prove he could be controlled. The stage manager knocked. 1 minute, Dean stood, adjusted his cuffs, straightened his bow tie. If he ignored the request, it would be noticed. Torino would be watching from his usual table in the back, the one never listed on seating charts but always reserved. The omission would be seen as defiance. And defiance came with consequences, not dramatic, but steady. Future pressure, contract complications, scheduling problems, bookings that suddenly became difficult. The small mechanics that kept a Vegas career running smoothly would start to break down. Nothing you could point to directly, nothing you could fight openly, just friction. If he complied, it would be worse. It would set a precedent, signal that personal grief could be weaponized, that private memories could be used as tools, that there were no boundaries Vincent Torino couldn't cross, and once that door opened, it never closed. Both options were losses. So Dean chose a third path. The showroom was dark except for the stage lights. 2,000 people filled the room. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. Ice clinked in glasses. The ambient noise of wealth and expectation. Conversations about business, about shows, about nothing important, but delivered with the confidence that came from expensive drinks and expensive seats. Dean stepped into the light. No announcement, no fanfare, Just the quiet shift that happened when he appeared, conversations dying, cigarettes stubbed out, attention settling. He walked to the microphone, smiled. Not the big showman smile, the smaller one, the one that felt like talking to a friend. The room quieted completely. Dean adjusted the mic stand, looked out at the audience with that familiar ease, like he'd just wandered in from a conversation somewhere else and decided to stay. In the back of the room, Vincent Torino sat at his table, his drink untouched, his face showing nothing. But he was listening. Everyone was listening. Dean let the silence stretch, let the audience settle into the quiet, let the weight of their attention build until the room felt smaller than it was. A woman in the third row leaned forward slightly, champagne glass halfway to her lips. A lighting technician at the side of the stage paused mid-adjustment. In the orchestra pit, the pianist's fingers rested on the keys, waiting. Then Dean spoke. "You know," he said, voice smooth and low, "someone asked me earlier to sing a song tonight. A particular song, one my mother used to sing." The words landed softly, conversational, like he was sharing an anecdote, nothing more. The room stayed quiet, listening. "And I thought about it," Dean continued. "I really did." He paused, just long enough for Torino to understand what was coming, just long enough for the room to lean in further. "But see, my mother never liked being told what to do either." The room laughed, not huge, warm, knowing. The kind of laugh that comes when something lands exactly right, when a joke feels less like performance and more like truth delivered lightly. The woman in the third row smiled, shaking her head slightly, charmed. The waiter near the back resumed moving, but slower, still processing. In the orchestra pit, the pianist's shoulders relaxed. Dean smiled, raised his glass in a small salute, and nodded to the band. The music started. Not ex torna a Soriento, but Everybody Loves Somebody. In the back of the room, Vincent Torino's jaw tightened, just slightly, barely perceptible unless you were watching closely. He lifted his drink, took a slow, deliberate sip, set it down with controlled precision. His hand remained on the glass for a moment, fingers drumming once against the crystal. Then he straightened his tie. Around him, the people at his table shifted, uncertain, waiting for a cue that would tell them how to react, what this meant, whether there would be consequences. None came. Torino stood quietly. No scene, no confrontation, no signal to his associates beyond the simple act of standing. He buttoned his jacket with slow, measured movements, glanced toward the stage where Dean was singing, his voice filling the room with easy confidence. Then he walked out. His associates followed moments later, moving through the crowd like water finding gaps, disappearing through the rear exit without drawing attention. The audience didn't notice. They were watching Dean, listening to him sing, laughing at the small jokes he wove between verses. But backstage, people saw. A waitress who'd been refilling drinks saw the table empty. She glanced toward the stage, then toward the exit, her expression confused. She looked to the floor manager, who stood near the wall with his clipboard, watching. The floor manager's face showed nothing, but he made a small note on his clipboard, then folded it closed and walked away. One of the stagehands, an older man who'd worked Vegas for 20 years, saw it too. He was standing in the wings watching Dean perform, but his eyes kept drifting to the back of the room, to the empty table that was never supposed to be empty during a show. He said nothing, but he understood. What Dean had done was deceptively simple. He hadn't refused directly, hadn't accused anyone, hadn't made a speech about integrity or independence or personal boundaries. He'd simply acknowledged the request in public. By doing so, he made it visible. And by making it visible, with 2,000 witnesses in the room, he removed its power. Leverage only works in private. Control only functions when the controlled party has something to hide, something they're afraid will be exposed. The moment Dean spoke about the request openly, framed it lightly, made it part of the show, it ceased to be a secret weapon. It became a known fact. and known facts in Las Vegas had to be handled differently. Retaliating now would look petty, would look like the casino or the people behind it couldn't handle a performer making a joke, would draw attention to the fact that there had been pressure, that someone had tried to manipulate Dean Martin into performing emotional compliance. That kind of attention was bad for business. Casinos operated on the illusion of glamour and ease. High rollers came to Vegas to feel powerful, to feel untouchable. They didn't come to watch management struggle with talent. They didn't come to see control attempts made visible. So the request was dropped, not discussed, not repeated, simply dissolved. But that didn't mean it was over. The show continued for 90 minutes. Dean sang the usual mix, swing standards, ballads, a few jokes between songs, a couple of sips from the glass he always kept on stage. The audience loved it. They always did. But backstage, the conversation was different. The wardrobe assistant heard it from the lighting director. The stage manager heard it from the sound engineer. By the time Dean took his final bow, half the crew knew something had happened. They'd seen the table empty early, heard Dean's joke about his mother, felt the shift in the room, that subtle change in temperature that happens when power moves. In the dressing room after, Dean sat alone, poured himself bourbon, no ice. The adrenaline was fading now, the careful control he'd maintained on stage loosening slightly in private. He'd done what he needed to do, made the request visible, made retaliation costly. But he didn't know yet if it would hold. There was a knock. His music director entered, closing the door carefully. He looked tired, older than usual. "That was something," he said quietly. Dean sipped his drink, said nothing. The table in the back. They left. Dean nodded once. "Early," the music director added, "before the second set." He walked further into the room, sat down in the chair opposite Dean. "I got a message," he said, "right after you went into the second set, from someone in the pit." Dean's expression didn't change, but he was listening. One of Torino's guys, the ones who left with him. He stopped on his way out, spoke to the floor manager, just for a moment. "What did he say?" The music director hesitated. He said, "Tell Mr. Martin we hope he enjoyed his joke." The words hung in the air. Dean set down his drink slowly. "That was it?" he asked. "That was it?" Dean absorbed this. The phrasing was careful, ambiguous. It could be read as gracious, acknowledging the joke, moving on. Or it could be read as something else, a reminder, a signal that the interaction had been noted, that nothing was forgotten. "You think they're going to push back?" the music director asked. Dean didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the strip, the lights burning bright against the desert dark. "I don't know," he said finally. "But they can't do it directly. Not now. Not after what I said in front of everyone." So what happens?" Dean turned back from the window. "We wait," he said, "and we see if the requests stop." The uncertainty lasted 3 days. 3 days where everything appeared normal but nothing felt normal. Dean performed each night. The shows went smoothly. The audiences were good. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked. But backstage, there was tension. The crew was quieter than usual. Conversations stopped when Dean walked by, not because anyone was angry, but because no one knew what to say. People watched him more carefully, as if expecting something to happen but not knowing what. The usual pre-show visits from casino management didn't come. No one stopped by the dressing room to say hello, to check if Dean needed anything, to make small talk about the house or the crowd or the previous night's show. The silence was noticeable. On the first night, Dean's music director mentioned it. "Have you heard anything?" he asked before the show. Dean shook his head. "Nothing. No messages, no requests, no contact at all." "That's not normal." "But no," Dean agreed. "It's not." The music director looked worried. "You think that's good or bad?" Dean considered this. "I think it means they're deciding whether to let it go or escalate. And if they escalate, Dean adjusted his cuffs, checked his appearance in the mirror. Then we deal with it. But I don't think they will. Why not? Because escalating now makes them look small, and they can't afford to look small. But Dean didn't sound as certain as his words suggested. On the second night, the tension increased. A stagehand Dean had worked with for years approached him in the hallway before the show. Started to say something, then stopped, changed his mind, walked away without speaking. Den watched him go, said nothing. During the show that night, he noticed one of Torino's usual associates sitting at a different table. Not the back table. A side table. Close enough to watch but far enough to seem casual. The man stayed for the entire performance. Didn't leave early. Didn't make a scene. Just watched. After the show, Din asked his music director if he'd noticed. I saw him, the music director confirmed. You think he was sent? Maybe. Or maybe he just wanted to see what would happen. Nothing happened. No, Dean said. Nothing happened. But the fact that someone had been watching meant the situation wasn't resolved. It was suspended, hanging, waiting for something to tip it one way or the other. On the third night, Dean walked to the stage with the same careful control he always maintained. But inside, he was calculating. If Torino was going to push back, it would happen soon. The longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to act without looking reactive. But if the silence lasted too long without any signal, it meant Dean had guessed wrong. That Torino was planning something else, something quieter, something that wouldn't look like retaliation but would function the same way. The show went well. The audience responded. Dean performed exactly the way he always performed, but when he walked off stage, he didn't know if it was over or just beginning. The tension broke on the fourth day, not dramatically, not obviously, but in a way that everyone backstage noticed immediately. A floor manager appeared before the show, not the same one who'd been avoiding Dean's dressing room for 3 days. A different one, younger, less connected. He knocked politely, entered when invited. Mr. Martin, he said, just wanted to check if you needed anything tonight. Make sure everything's set for the show. It was routine, the kind of thing that happened before most shows, but it hadn't happened in 3 days. Dean smiled. Everything's fine. Thank you. The floor manager nodded, started to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Martin, he said, management wanted me to let you know, if there's anything you need adjusted with your contract, any preferences for future bookings, just let us know. We want to make sure you're comfortable here. The message was clear. The casino was signaling cooperation, offering flexibility, making it known that Dean's position was secure. It was an olive branch, delivered through a junior employee, someone with no direct connection to Vincent Torino, someone who could deliver the message without it looking like Torino had backed down. Deniable. Casual. But appreciate that, Dean said. The floor manager nodded again. Left. Dean's music director had been listening from the corner of the room. He looked at Dean, eyebrows raised. That was them backing down, he said quietly. Dean agreed. They're not going to push back. No, not. The music director exhaled slowly, relief visible in his posture for the first time in days. How did you know? He asked. How did you know they wouldn't escalate? Dean lit a cigarette. Took a slow drag. Because I made the request public, he said. I made it visible. And once it was visible, retaliating became too expensive. It would have looked personal, vindictive, bad for business. He paused. Let smoke drift toward the ceiling. Control only works when it's invisible, he continued. The moment you shine a light on it, it loses power, because then everyone's watching, and no one wants to be seen forcing someone to do something they don't want to do. The music director nodded slowly, absorbing this. So it's over. It's over, Dean confirmed. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite that simple. It was over in the sense that Torino wouldn't push back directly, wouldn't make another request like this one. wouldn't test Dean this way again. But something had shifted. Den had drawn a line, made it visible, and everyone who mattered had seen it. That changed things in ways that wouldn't be obvious immediately, but would matter over time. In the weeks that followed, the soft requests stopped, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, noticeable ways that added up to something larger. A week after the incident, the same messenger who delivered Torino's request appeared backstage before another show. But this time he simply nodded to Dean in passing. No envelope. No quiet suggestion. Just acknowledgement. 2 weeks later, a floor manager started to approach Dean's music director with what looked like a request. Something about mentioning a high roller's birthday from the stage. But he stopped halfway across the room, reconsidered, changed direction. The request was never delivered. A month later, another performer mentioned to Dean that the suggestion list for his show had gotten noticeably shorter. The little notes that used to appear in dressing rooms. Requests for specific songs, dedications, table acknowledgments had thinned out. "You do something," the performer asked. Dean shrugged. "Just told a joke." The performer looked at him for a long moment. A slight smile. Then he changed the subject, but the information moved through the performer community quietly, not as gossip, not as rebellion, as observation. Dean Martin had drawn a line, and the line had held, not because he'd fought, not because he'd threatened, but because he'd made a private control attempt public in a way that was too smooth, too casual, too witness to be punished without looking vindictive. Other performers noticed. A comedian started declining certain table visits, citing time constraints. A singer stopped mentioning specific names from the stage unless they were friends. Small refusals. Quiet ones. Nothing that created waves, but the pattern had changed, and it had started with Dean Martin making a joke about his mother. The story became legend slowly, not through official channels, not through interviews or publicity or press releases, through the people who'd been there. A waitress would mention it years later, working a different casino, talking to a new performer who was nervous about a request they'd received. "I was there the night Dean Martin told that joke about his mother," she'd say. "You had to be there to understand what it meant." But after that, the request stopped. Just stopped. A stagehand would tell it over drinks after a late shift. "I worked the sands for 20 years, saw everything. Senator's tantrums, Sammy's energy, Joey's chaos. But the night Dean shut down Torino without saying his name, that was something else. That was the smoothest piece of work I ever saw." A lighting director would mention it to a younger crew member who was complaining about management pressure. Dean Martin once got asked to sing a song about his dead mother. 5 minutes before curtain, you know what he did? He walked on stage and made a joke about it. One joke. That was it. The guy who made the request walked out. Never bothered Dean again. The story spread the way Vegas stories do. Passed quietly between people who understood what they were really talking about. Not about a joke. About a line drawn so clearly that crossing it again became impossible. About the moment Vincent Torino, a man who'd controlled performers for decades through careful pressure and strategic requests, walked out of a showroom because Dean Martin had made his control attempt visible. About power held through restraint, not force. The details would shift slightly with each telling. Sometimes the song was different. Sometimes the timing changed. Sometimes Torino's reaction was described as angry, sometimes as impressed, sometimes as simply resigned, but the core remained the same. Dean Martin had refused to be moved, and he'd done it so smoothly that retaliation became impossible. Years later, a casino executive would mention it during a training session for new entertainment coordinators. "There's a story about Dean Martin," he'd say. "Back in the 60s, someone tried to control him through something personal, family stuff, and Dean just exposed it, made it public. Didn't make a scene, didn't fight, just made it impossible to push him without everyone knowing. That's the kind of move you can't teach. Either you see it or you don't. But a music director who'd worked multiple Vegas acts would tell younger musicians, Dean Martin understood something most performers don't. In Vegas, the real power isn't in saying no. It's in making the request so visible that saying yes becomes unnecessary. Force them to be obvious. Force them to show their hand. Once everyone's watching, control becomes too expensive. The story became shorthand. When someone in the Vegas entertainment community wanted to describe a performer who'd successfully resisted pressure without creating a scene, they'd say, "He pulled a Dan Martin." Everyone knew what it meant. Dan Martin never spoke about the incident publicly, never wrote about it, never explained it in interviews, never framed it as a moment of personal triumph or a stand against control. He simply moved forward, because that's what the moment required. Not explanation, not justification, just clarity. The song his mother used to sing remained private. Dean never performed Torna Asuriento, never recorded it, never mentioned it again. On quiet nights, alone in hotel rooms after shows, he'd sometimes hum it, just a few bars, just enough to remember her voice, her hands moving over the stove, the small house in Steubenville that smelled like garlic and bread. That part of his life stayed where he wanted it, protected. His, and the people who thought they could move him by invoking it learned otherwise, quietly, permanently, without needing to be told twice. There's a particular kind of power in refusing to explain yourself, not out of arrogance, not out of secrecy, but because some things lose their weight the moment they're articulated. Grief is one of those things. So is control. Vincent Torino's attempt relied on the assumption that Dean would keep it private, that he'd either comply quietly or refuse quietly, and either way, the leverage would remain intact for future use. By speaking about it publicly, lightly, without drama, Dean removed it from the private realm where manipulation lives. He didn't weaponize his mother's memory, didn't use her as a shield or a symbol. He simply acknowledged that someone had asked, and that he'd chosen differently. That was enough. Las Vegas in the 1960s was a place where power moved quietly. Deals were made in back rooms. Influence was exerted through suggestions. Performers, dealers, managers. Everyone understood the unspoken rules. You didn't cross certain people. You didn't make certain refusals. You cooperated when asked, because cooperation kept the machinery running smoothly. Most people played along. Dean Martin did too in most cases. He took the photos, made the introductions, adjusted set lists when the requests made sense. But when the request crossed into the territory of private grief, when it stopped being about business and became about testing whether personal pain could be used as a tool, he drew a line, not with anger, not with threats, with one sentence that sounded like a joke but wasn't. A sentence his mother would have understood. A sentence that said, simply, "You don't get to make me smaller." There are stories about Las Vegas that get repeated often. The wild nights, the mobsters, the glamour and danger tangled together. And then there are the stories that don't get told as much. The small moments of refusal, the quiet boundaries held, the times someone said no without raising their voice. Those moments don't make headlines. They don't fit neatly into documentaries about organized crime or the golden age of entertainment. But they mattered. To the people in the room, to the people who understood what was really being negotiated, and to the man standing on stage, holding a glass and a microphone, singing songs that sounded effortless because he'd worked so hard to make them sound that way. Dean Martin walked off stage that night the same way he'd walked on. Calm, loose, smiling. No one in the audience knew what had just happened. But the people who needed to know, they understood, and that was all that mattered. If someone tried to use the person you loved most to control you, would you stay quiet or draw a line, leave a comment? I read every one. And if stories like this matter to you, the moments that reveal who someone really was, the boundaries held without speeches, the power found in silence, there are more waiting here.